Okay, so if y'all remember the exam two, I've gotten a couple emails from students concerned that y'all wouldn't have enough time to be able to write all your circles, all your lists, all your stuff, and answer the questions. So in response to that, I was like, well, let's try 20 questions. But it seemed like everybody had plenty of time. So it was a legitimate concern. But I think after doing it, I don't think that's as much of a concern. So I was going to put more like 30 questions, 30, 33 questions. That way I could add more of the different type of questions that we do in class. What's the function, or list me two functions of these muscles, and I could list, right? How would you stretch this? And then application, identify an agonist and a contraction. So it gives me more options to do those different kind of questions that we've been answering. Okay. All right, you guys, what do you talk about? Absolutely. Okay, so before we get into muscles, we know that we have as many groups of muscles as we have allowable joint motions, right? So the wrist has four motions. The wrist is a biaxial, what we call an ellipsoid joint. So the wrist can go in the rotate in its sagittal plane. Close to the fetal, we call flexion. Further away from fetal, we call extension, right? The wrist can also move in its frontal plane. We just know the wrist can't move in the transverse plane, right? It's the radial ulnar joint. So the frontal plane motion of the wrist, we don't say ab and adduction because we have fingers that ab and adduct. We got the shoulders that ab and adduct. There's too many things that front. So what we use is we use a term called ulna and radial deviation. And it's as simple as the pinky is always going to be on the ulnar side and the thumb will always be on the radius side. And that's because it doesn't twist. So it's always going to be splinted. My pinky will always be ulnar and my thumb will always be radial. Okay? So ulnar deviation, radial deviation. That being said, we have muscles that pull in the direction of both of those motions. We call those the ulnar deviators and the radial deviators. The ulnar deviators, and a little caveat, I love these muscles because at least they have some function in their name. I love muscles that have function pull in their name. Flexor and extensor carpi ulnaris are ulnar deviation pullers. So the flexor carpi ulnaris is a wrist flexor and a wrist ulnar deviation puller. And the extensor carpi ulnaris is a wrist extensor puller and an ulnar deviation. Okay. So the ulnar deviation pullers, flexor and extensor carpi ulnaris. Then you have the flexor carpi radialis and the extensor carpi radialis. So the radial deviation pullers are the radial side muscles, the ones that are on the radial side, the thumb side. So flexor carpi radialis is a wrist flexor radial deviator. And the extensor carpi radialis is an extensor radial deviator. What's cool about them is they can cancel each other out sagittally and just work together frontally, right? So like you get this cancellation so that if you need ulnar deviators, these cancel out here and they can work together there. These two cancel out here and so that they can work together here. So that's how those work. So in your circle is from anatomical position. And it's all right-sided because the left side is just a mirror of the right. So if you look at your wrist muscles, let's see, three muscles in the wrist. Your ulnar deviators are going to be medial because in anatomical position, your pinky is medial. So your ulnar deviators are going to be these. And your radial deviators are going to be lateral. Now, if I pronate, well, now these are my radial deviators because they're still thumb side, right? So the thumb side muscles are going to stay thumb side, and the pinky side muscles are going to stay pinky side. Did that answer? Yes. Good. You're very welcome. Sometimes I over-explain, but I always like to try to start from the beginning. Like, well, let's go over the motions, and then we have to understand we have muscles that pull in every motion, and then these are those muscles. Mm-hmm.
This is also kind of like the first question.
Yeah. Come on.
How can you properly stretch the traps? Because, like I said, it's personal.
Very tough. Yeah.
It's hard for me to stretch it.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Yeah. So let's have a conversation about trap stretch. One of our limitations is the fact that it's a fan-shaped muscle. So what I mean by that is, and we're going to get to the trap, but let's go to a muscle that we're more familiar with in the deltoid. Okay. So all of the fibers of the deltoid are abduction pullers, right? The anterior, though, has a different pull than the posterior in two different planes. The anterior pulls in flexion and the posterior pulls in extension. Anterior is an internal rotation puller, posterior is a posterior. So the point is that outside of being adducted, let's play with my emotions. Outside of being adducted, any way to stretch one side is not going to stretch the other. So in other words, if we look at it holistically, there is no one position that will cover all of our bases of a fan outside of the one thing they all do. So far, so good? Okay. So now let's apply that to our traps. What do all of our fibers of our traps do? Two main things, right? They're upward rotation pullers. So that means when I'm downwardly rotated, they're already kind of lengthened. I can't downwardly rotate any more than I'm kind of at. And they're retraction pullers. So the only way to get all of them is to have protraction. Now we can look at them separately and we say, okay, the anterior, I'm using an analogy, but like the anterior fibers, the upper part, are elevation pullers. So if I protract and depress, maybe I can target those upper fibers more. If I protract and elevate, maybe I can target the lower fibers. So you have to use selective targeting when dealing with the fan outside of what they all do. And it's a lot easier to compartmentalize because at least you could get some combination stuff in there. You're welcome. Anytime. Great question. I wore my ugly Christmas sweater today. Do you remember that meme with the ladies and the cat? And they're like yelling at the cat, and the cat's like, that's what this is supposed to be, but it's getting kind of old. Instead of just to make it easier, I'll use my dumbbells today. Yoink. Use my dumbbells today. First one. All right. Sorry. Let's see. Set a bench. Start. Finish. So question number one might be from A to B. Question number two may be from B to C. Question number two, dumbbell goes up. Question number one, dumbbell goes up. Question number two, dumbbell goes down. we have to separate them into those. So one repetition is it starts and then finishes in the same place. But we have to separate it because, again, two different motions, two different contractions, same muscles. So that's why we separate them into those phases. The concentric phase or the eccentric phase. It's not a movement. It's actually movements. Right? To go back to where you started, you got to go one way, then you got to go back the other. So gravity would be trying to do what to my scapula? Protract me. So I would need scapular retractors. So this is how, I think I met with a student, this is how I would do it. Again, you do it your way, I just want right answers. I would bring everything back to the agonist pole because that tells me who I need. That reminds me of who I need because of how they pull. So I know I need retractors, my left scapular retractors, because I can see why I need them. Dumbbells trying to protract me, I need retractors. Once you have here, it's like a fork in the road. I need left scapular retractors. Who are those muscles? Is one deviation off of the agonist pull. Trapezius, rhomboids, levator scapula. So who are those retraction pulls? Then when it comes to contraction, I would actually go back up the road to agonist because, again, it has pull in it. Trap doesn't tell you pull. Rhomboids doesn't tell you how they pull. So if I observe retraction, I go back up to my agonist and I say retractors do retraction through concentrics. But if I stay at the individual muscles, I lose that equation that I taught y'all in 310. I lose the concept of muscles that pull this way do motion that way through this type of contraction, and muscles that pull this way do the other way, right? The whole negative works. So in phase one, or question number one, retractors do retraction through concentrics. And in phase two, retractors are going to do protraction through eccentrics. But it's the same muscles, the same retractors are going to do different motions, do different contractions. If you have the same variable here and a different variable here, something's got to be different on the other side. So if I have different motion done by the same muscles, the contraction has to be different.
Oh, can you do or show like two exercises that show the difference between scapular depression and scapular down rotation?
The key though is that when you're doing, I can't, but I want to reemphasize though that elevation and upper rotation commonly go hand in hand. Because usually, but for different reasons. The upper rotation of the scapula is meant to get your clock hand up to noon globally, right? And the elevation is to literally get your clock a little higher for what you're trying to grab and reach. So in other words, I can move my clock hand to 12, but still have some extra scapula to help me raise up and rise up, right? So although they happen together a lot, that's why we separate them, because one is literally trying to rotate the clock hand to help me get at 12. The other one is literally trying to raise the clock to help me get up a little higher in a functional circle. A good example of elevation and depression by themselves is either shrugs, because I'm not trying to move my clock hand, or like dip pluses, where you're just trying to depress the scapula. So like, it's like if I'm here, I'd be using my scapular depressors because table and gravity are trying to elevate. That has nothing to do with my clock hand, so I don't have to have the upper rotators at the down rotator. And then exercises like lat pull down, upright row. So you'll have the combination of the elevation and the upper rotators because they're trying to rotate the clock hand and also trying to move the clock.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Every now and then I have a good day. But it is, they go hand in hand, but only when you have to move the clock. Sometimes you don't have to move the clock, and sometimes you don't have to move the clock in, you just move the clock. That's why in 310, as a reminder, I know you got it, it's hard to remember everything. I do because I do it every semester. But that's why in 310, I said, okay, guys, I would only ask you upward and downward rotation questions when I incorporate shoulder motion. So like when you're bringing your arms up, whether that's through the sagittal road or the frontal road, the scapula's going to upwardly rotate. So like my scapula wouldn't need to upwardly or downwardly rotate if I'm doing here. Because my clock hand isn't, I'm not helping my clock hand up or down, right? So in this regard, I would just, the scapular contribution can be protraction and retraction because there's no need for any elevation, depression, or upward or downward rotation if horizontally. But the protraction, the retraction is, right? Protraction, retraction can help my function, can help my shoulder. Because remember, the whole point of scapula is to help get you a little higher. It goes down to the pelvic girdle too. If I'm trying to abduct my leg to get it up high, my pelvic girdle can help me get a big extra range of motion by pelvic girdle rotated. It's just my scapula is independent inside of the pelvic girdle. It's shoulder girdle. That's why they have it. So it's all about help. If I didn't have my shoulder girdle, I'd feel like a T-Rex. This is all extra because of the scapula. It's a huge extra for us to be able to work and move and function. I think in class one time I said, just try, if you're ever doing like rows, try to separate the scapula from the shoulder. It's a huge difference. You're using inertia twice. But like if you're going to row, instead of doing all of this in one motion, and in fact, a lot of times people will use the trim rotators too. Isolate and retract first, stop that momentum, and then use shoulder and elbow. Lower it, keep that scapula retracted. Do them in separate movements, and that can really help you identify, oh, that was scapula. I felt it. That was shoulder. But when you do it all together, sometimes it's hard to separate those things. Questions? What else y'all want?
Reaching the breakover valves, essentially the hammer.
Yeah. I don't have a hammer, but I have something that can represent a hammer. Okay. I'll try a different route because I think we did brachioradialis stuff Monday. So in other words, I'm going to try to do it a different way, just so that you have as many variables as you can. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what's happening, and then you can have a follow-up. Why it would be, and that can help me explain. Okay. In this position, I need supinators, and the brachioradialis can help the supinators. Because the brachioradialis is a supination puller when I'm in this quadrant, when I'm in this side of radial joint motion. Okay. In this position, I need pronators. The brachioradialis can be a pronator in this position because of how it pulls. It wants to pull up to midway. Okay. So supinators with the brachioradialis as a supinator, pronators with the brachioradialis as a pronator. Okay. In this quadrant, if I need supinators and I'm in quadrant 2, brachioradialis is like, check, I can help. So that means if I need supinators, eccentrically, brachioradialis can help, just like it would isometrically. If I need supinators concentrically, brachioradialis can help. That'd be like saying, why wouldn't I use the bicep concentrically and the bicep eccentric? Okay. So all of this motion was done by my supinators, of which the brachioradialis can be part of the T. Okay. On this side, all of this motion is pronators, of which the brachioradialis could be part of this T. Eccentric, concentric, eccentric, concentric. one way to look at it, like in terms of a proof, is that I know that the brachioradialis is a pronator quadrant 1. So when I need pronators, gravity's trying to do this. So I would need pronators. Brachioradialis is like, that's just negated. Pronators, concentric, pronation. Pronators, eccentric, supination. Concentric, eccentric, same muscles. Okay. When would you not need the brachioradialis to do process of elimination? If my bicep, which is an elbow flexor, can do flexion concentrically, then the bicep cannot do extension concentrically. Does that make sense? So if the brachioradialis can be a pronator concentrically for pronation in quadrant 1, it cannot do supination concentrically in quadrant 1. It's the same concept. If it's concentric. If it's concentric. So it can do supination concentrically, but you know what it can't do? Pronation concentrically. So it's the same concept. If the bicep, which is an elbow flexor, can do flexion concentrically as an agonist, then it can't do extension concentrically as an agonist, because it can only do extension eccentrically, is what I'm trying to say. So if it can do pronation concentrically in quadrant 1, then it can't do supination concentrically in quadrant 1. If it can do supination eccentrically in quadrant 1, then it can't do pronation eccentrically in quadrant 1. Like, we're trying to use that same logic for something that's more obvious.
How do you tell which quadrant it is?
So radial on a joint position, anatomical is where we start. Anatomical. And a full range of motion for the radial on a joint is about 180 degrees. Okay, so like I'm going to use my thumb. And let's say my thumb starts 180 and it goes to 0. Okay. Halfway, at 90 degrees, halfway, is when the brachioradialis doesn't have any obliquity to it. It's almost like 90 degrees, the brachioradialis is running straight up and down, like our rectus runs straight up and down in anatomical. So quadrant 1 is anywhere between anatomical and semi-prone. Because anywhere between here and there, that muscle is trying to pull this way when it's an agonist. It always pulls that way. As an agonist, it can only pull this. It can't push me down. Quadrant 2 is semi-prone, or 90 degrees, to fully prone. So it's like, supposed to be a thumb. Here to here. Quadrant 1. So from anatomical to semi-prone. From semi-prone to prone. It's quadrant 2. And the brachioradialis, that's why it's called a midway muscle, because it can only pull to midway, transverse. So think of it like this. A practical example would be if I had a string. Think of it like this. If I had a pipe, or this represents my thumb. If I had a string tied to the end and the pipe leaned to the right, my string can only pull until it gets here. It can't push it over. But if the pipe starts to drift to the left, the string could also pull it back to the middle. Does that make sense? So if you think about it, it's doing kind of the same thing. It's just if it leans on this side, it wants to pull it back. And if it leans on this side, it wants to pull it back. Anatomical position is leaning this way. Semi-prone position is here. So when I'm in quadrant 1, the brachioradialis is a pronation puller. But if I drift off into quadrant 2, the brachioradialis is now a supination puller. Does that make sense? Yes. Now that doesn't mean it's always going to be an agonist, right? It depends. But if I need a pronator, and I'm in quadrant 1 and I need pronators, the brachioradialis is like, awesome, I can help. So I pull that way. And if I'm in quadrant 2 and I need pronators, brachioradialis is like, sorry guys, I can't push you. All I can do is pull up. If you drift, I can pull this way, but if you drift off into quadrant 2, I can't do nothing for you that way. I can only pull back. So if you need a pronator in quadrant 1, brachioradialis question is yes. If you need a supinator in quadrant 2, the brachioradialis answer is yes. But if you need a supinator in quadrant 1, the brachioradialis answer is no. It doesn't pull that way. And if you need a pronator in quadrant 2, brachioradialis answer is no. Is that better? So maybe that would be a good strategy, is just to learn. There's no exceptions. It's a pronator here, and it's a supinator here. So if I need a pronator here, yes. If I need a supinator here, yes. But then the mirror opposite, if I need a supinator here, no. And if I need a pronator here, no. Because it can't be both at the same time.
So you start in quadrant 1, and you start the pronate, you go to semi-prone, and then whenever you go into quadrant 2, like the brachioradialis just shuts it off.
Not true. Actually, it would be an agonist as a supinator.
Okay.
In this example, brachioradialis, concentric pronator, concentric pronator, concentric pronator, eccentric supinator, eccentric supinator, eccentric supinator, concentric supinator, eccentric pronator, concentric pronator.
So first drop.
And it depends on the situation. In this situation, because gravity's trying, that's why we always bring it back to gravity. Gravity's trying to supinate me here, but gravity's trying to pronate me here. So I need pronators here in this exercise. Yes. And I need supinators here in this exercise. Yes. That's why.
Like an example for a question, if you were to give us one where they're supinated and you say that the end position is pronated, would one answer to brachioradialis works concentrically to semi-prone?
And then eccentrically prone. And it would be a pronator to semi-prone, but it would be a supinator from semi-prone. It switches sides. And that's another good example of why we don't necessarily specifically do muscles in motion, right? You have a full range of motion of pronation, but gravity was trying to do two different things during the range of motion. No different, guys. No different than if I asked you, hey guys, would I be using the same muscles for this full range of motion of shoulder flexion? No, because back here, gravity's trying to flex me, and over here, gravity's trying to extend me. Kind of the same thing. You know, I did a full range of motion, but I'm not using the same muscles the whole time. So for this example, if you started here and you did a full range of motion, gravity's trying to supinate me. I need pronators. Brachioradialis is like, I can help with that. But as I keep pronating, after I get past semi-prone, gravity's now trying to pronate me. I don't need pronators anymore. I need supinators. Brachioradialis is like, I'm down. Makes sense. So it's about the exercise. So that's why, like, I tried to say, gravity's trying to pronate me here, but what if something, instead of trying to make me pronate in quadrant 2, was trying to make me supinate in quadrant 2? Well, if something's trying to make me supinate in quadrant 2, and I'm resisting that isometrically, I need pronators, right? Brachioradialis is like, dude, I'd love to help, but I can't be a pronator in quadrant 2. Does that make sense? Brachioradialis is like, let me know when you need a supination pull. I'm your Huckleberry, but I can't be a pronation puller in quadrant 2 because I can't push you down. We could play the same game here. Here I know I need pronators because gravity's trying to supinate me. But what if something else was, instead of trying to supinate me, something was trying to pronate me? You know, an external force. So you're doing an exercise. You're like, don't let me push this up. So now I'm in quadrant 1, but I don't need pronation pullers. I need supination pullers. Well, brachioradialis can't be a supinator. Why? Because it can't push you down. It can only pull you up. So maybe that's a good strategy. It's kind of process of elimination. Identify the agonist. It always comes down to agonist. It starts with agonist. Identify the agonist and then ask yourself, am I in a position where the brachioradialis can offer assistance? If it's pronators in quadrant 1, yes. If it's supinators in quadrant 2, yes. But if it's supinators in quadrant 1, no. And if it's pronators in quadrant 2, also, I think this should be clear. If you happen to be in a semi-prone position, then the brachioradialis is like, I'm only an elbow flexor. I can only pull this way. There's no more. The pole is as straight as it can get. You got to drift. So if it's here, then the brachioradialis has a zero function at the radial joint because can't pull it any other way. Is that better? I think I like my art. It kind of looks like Charlie Brown, like laying down ears, nose. Like laying down, looking at the scene. Mickey Mouse house? Yeah, that's better. It's the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. Come inside, it's fun inside. Anybody want a Tootsie Pop? On the teacher evaluations. Teacher constantly offers kids candy. I just start putting it at the door. You can go. Was that a better clarification? It follows the same rules. You know, like I said, I think bringing it back to something you're comfortable with, you know, when the bicep and the brachialis and the brachioradialis is elbow flexors, you know that when those flexion pullers do flexion, it's concentric. So if the flexors can do flexion concentrically, they cannot do extension concentric. Their only option is to do eccentric extension. So it's very simple. The brachioradialis can do pronation concentrically and supination eccentrically in quadrant 1. So it can't do pronation eccentrically and supination concentrically in quadrant 1.
With the pegs, based on the insertion points on the humerus, if you were to turn your this way,
Are you moving your radial ulnar joint, or are you moving your shoulder? Are you externally rotating?
well, the way I was thinking was like.
I just, you're thinking right. I just want to confirm to make sure we're on the same page of what the change in position is.
Maybe still in.
So your pec is, so let's walk it. I'm going to take a different approach. The pec has nothing to do with our radial ulnar joint. True? Like it doesn't function in the radial. So it doesn't matter if I do this to my pec. It does matter at my shoulder, right? So if I externally rotate my shoulder, which it seemed like you did when you also did this, that external rotation would lengthen it at the shoulder. But the pec isn't an extensor. So I think it also depends on what your exercise that you're doing. When you reposition that shoulder, what was the exercise that you're trying to do?
Like the shoulder, like I see sometimes before the shoulder, like.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah.
Or. This.
Yeah.
So like, do that external and internal rotation.
Yeah.
Like, turn all the peg.
Yeah. Gotcha. For those types of exercises, I don't think it's so much of like length tension or those kind of things. I think it's more about trying to keep your center of mass over your base of support. It's more of a stability thing. So like I had a former student call me. This was really kind of cool. He called me to talk about like the squat and he and how like putting your knees out and those kind of things. I was like, well, one of the things to keep in mind that it's a heck of a lot easier for us to move rigid things than to move like loose, constantly movable things. It's easier for us to move things that are more rigid than move, as my mom used to say, a sack of potatoes, where the mass is constant. So like things like interlocking our legs when we're doing things, or trying to create rigidity when we're moving things up and down, right? So I think one of the things when we're doing like shoulder presses where we stay sagittal is that all of that mass that's in the front is also trying to make us move like the trunk and other things, right, sagittally. But if we can transfer that into frontal, now these things cancel out. When I'm sagittal, there's nothing back there. There's nothing back there to cancel out. Does that kind of make sense? So like the natural transition to go from sagittal to frontal is a good way to add stability here, as opposed to having all that force here, or now like your trunk has to compensate that and stuff. So I think it's more about like natural to stability to have that kind of rotation happening. Because if you stay sagittal, like you can just kind of visualize it, like that would be really hard on your back. And again, you have like more things trying to make you do this versus ending in the frontal plane. Now you're very stable because now it's like a teeter top. Like at least when I'm here, this can cancel out that and I'm much more stable. But when I do this, there's nothing back there. In fact, I have two things more in the front and nothing in the back to cancel it out. So it puts a heck of a lot more. So what we were talking about for the squat is that like for your pelvis, if you stay sagittal, it's like if your knees stay in, right? you're having to sway your center of mass over your base of support. So like you could fall forward, you could fall back. When you externally rotate, you create like an arch where your right leg and your left leg, not only do you increase your base of support, but now this leg and that leg, it's like in fact, a really great picture. Like for structures, they'll create an arch, and at the top you have a key bone, and it's very structurally sound because like this side and that side kind of lean on each other. So when you go from sagittal, the right and left leg don't have anything to lean on. When you do this, your pelvis it's like an arch. It's very cool because now your pelvis is your key bone, and you have an arch happening on each side for stability. And stability in our world is like an exponential factor to being able to do things because you don't have to worry about sway, you don't have to worry about balance. You can like really hone in on your innovation for those muscles contracting, and you don't have this extra distraction. So like in athletic training, one time, I think it was Dr. Lyle that told me, he said distraction gets in the way of recruiting muscles. So like in other words, if you're doing a manual muscle test, and let's say you have a bruise on your thigh, use this as an example. And I was doing a manual muscle test on your shoulder. Nothing wrong with your shoulder, right? Shoulder's fine, no injuries, no nothing. And I'm doing a manual muscle test, I'm pressing down. Say, don't let me push you down. Good strength. If I press on that bruise, what do you think is going to happen to your shoulder? Because you're distracted. Does that make sense? So he used this as an example. It's like strong shoulder, press on the bruise, because your body's like distracted. Right? So sometimes wobble or sway or instability, or in the case of like sagittal pressing, your low back muscles, because again, there's nothing on the other end of the teeter-totter. Your erector spinae would have to do all the teeter-totter work for all of the mass for both dumbbells being anterior, being in the front. It's a huge distraction. Versus going frontal, now at least I have right side canceling out teeter-totter backside, and my erector spinae is like, thank goodness, because I didn't have to do all that work. It's less distraction, more stability. The more energy, the more effort you can put into those agonistic muscles. I think it's more about that.
So well, never mind, that's a loaded question, I'm not worried about
Yeah, I just used the arch. I have a really good picture if I could find it, but I wanted to use that as a concept of how stability allows us to recruit more of the agonists because we're not distracted by secondary functions like balance or instability or again, in the case of the erector, having to be the group that pulls on the other end of the teeter-totter. That's a limiting factor. When we can eliminate that and be balanced and have rigid links to move, we can give more effort, we can give more energy. We're not as distracted. I think a good example, but what do you think you could do a better 1 rep max? I know this is an extreme example, but doing a shoulder press seated or on the ground, or doing a shoulder press while you're on like a medicine ball. Like your body is distracted by maintaining your balance. It's like, dude, do 2 pounds. I'm just trying to stay balanced here. That's an extreme example, but it's very similar when you can eliminate. That's why like some machines or even benches try to make you as stable as possible, so that you don't have these distractions and you can recruit more to doing the work. Remember too that so I want to talk about stability first. The second part is how your pec can become an abductor past 90. It's the second part of the conversation. It's a midway muscle. So in other words, down here, it's an adduction puller. It's pulling the humerus into the body. Okay. When I get to 90, now it's on my axis. But if I go past 90, it's still trying to pull my humerus to the middle of my body. Yeah. So there's also, so the secondary component is if I start here, upper pec is like game on, but I can get all of my pec if I go transverse. That's the secondary part, that by going from sagittal to transverse past 90, all of the fibers can now say game on. VLC.
You say that?
VLC, come here. Come see.
Oh.
It's a French thing my papa used to say. VLC ball, come here. Power of stability. I think in class I might use this silly analogy, like if you had to carry a friend up a flight of stairs to put them to bed because they passed out, that's a lot of work because they're, oh, come here, Bobby, right? When I was working, I used to work in college at the Fontana Center. We do offshore testing, and you know, lifting 100-pound rig or 100-pound sack that was rigid was not as hard as lifting sacks that had fluid, you know, rice or sand or, you know, things that shifted because the weight's the same, but the torque and your balance is constantly going to shift because you have shifting mass inside the sack. And so that challenge to your balance is a distraction that gets in the way of your muscle. Some people want distraction. You ever seen those TikTok videos of those people doing some crazy exercises, man? But they've progressed, you know, to be able to train their bodies to handle distraction. It'd be like if you were trying to do, I don't know, sometimes motivation, like music can increase. And also there's research that like actually expressing sound during contraction can help increase your, but that still comes to rigid links. So in other words, if you're like, yeah, you're creating rigidity as you shout or as you make these sounds. Yeah, it's a lot less distracting to move rigid things and move flaccid, freely. All right, any other questions? We're good? Awesome. I think this was a great day. Y'all have a good Thanksgiving. Y'all be safe. Thank you.